Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We are continuing with our reflections on Iqbal's reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, and we stopped here last time. The work of later mystics and non-mystic rationalists forms an exceedingly instructive chapter in the history of our culture. Inasmuch as it reveals a longing for a coherent system of ideas, a spirit of wholehearted devotion to truth. So these are two seems to be positive aspects. But the third element which casts shadow on these two positive elements is the limitation of the age, which rendered the various theological movements in Islam less fruitful than they might have been in a different age. And the limitation seems to be, as we all know, Greek philosophy has been a great cultural force in the history of Islam. Yet a careful study of the Quran and the various schools of scholastic theology that arose under the inspiration of Greek thought disclosed the remarkable fact that while Greek philosophy very much broadened the outlook of Muslim thinkers, it on the whole obscured their vision of the Quran. Okay, so Greek thought seems to be the limitation of. So let's. These are a lot of ideas here we need to unpack. So the most schools rationalist. So rationalist mystics or non-mystics. So what he means is mutakallimin, like kalam. So the positive aspect seems to be that they were inspired by the ideals of coherence and consistency, which is good because that's the requirement of rationality. So, and as we saw last time, that's a very important part of Islamic worldview. And devotion to the truth, which is also a very important part of the wholehearted devotion to truth. So these seems to be the positive aspect of the schools of Kalam, of general rationalist disciplines and movements in Islamic world. But they have their limitations as well. Now, first thing to say about this is, before we actually look at the limitations and the specificity, that every age has its limitations. So that's not a news. Every age and every human perspective has limitations, and those limitations can be described in two different species of those limitations. So limitations. The first one is, human knowledge is always knowledge about self and the world and the universe, animals, plants, other people is always changing. So generally, as time passes, I mean, it's not necessary, but as time passes, we learn and unlearn things. We are constantly, our knowledge is constantly changing and constantly progressing, sometimes regressing. So that's the aspect of human knowledge. We continuously learn and unlearn things. And there is some linearity in that, but there's no necessity that this process would be linear. So that's one sort of limitations. So, and obviously, actual individual human beings vary how much limitations they have, and different societies might vary in the limitations they have. And the second limitation is structural. For the lack of or suitable word, we can call it structural. As long as we don't take the word too seriously, the word itself is structural. Could have used a priori, but that will lead us to other problems. There are structural problems, and I don't want to talk about them in too much depth, because that will take us far from our current purpose, and also it's very. But what would suffice is just to give some idea of the structural limitations which humans might have, individual as well as societies. So all these individuals, societies, and ages all have these structural limitations, in the sense that what we see, and these limitations can be, one way to look at them is through the idea of perspectivism. We approach the object of our study as individual, as society, then from certain background presuppositions. And those background presuppositions have two functions. They are the conditions of the possibility of our acquiring knowledge at all. So they are not just restrained on our search to understand a particular object. They are actually necessary, but they also, depending on what presupposition we have, the same conditions which are the conditions of the possibility of understanding of certain object, and that object can be physical, cultural, social. They also, so they are conditioned, so we must approach them with certain background presupposition, otherwise we are not going to understand anything. And in that sense, they are conditions of the possibility of understanding anything. But by the very same token, they also hide a lot of different ways in which we can understand the said subject. So in that sense, our perspective is always partial. And because of human limitations and limitations of human societies and limitations of every human age, whenever we are trying to understand certain objects from certain perspective, we are going to miss certain other perspectives. As as human beings, as limited being, it's not possible for us to have God's eye view. Even if we try to, combine all the perspective, that would be a perspective in itself. And I think Heidegger said, or somebody else, to include is to exclude. So that's the sort of a dialectic. Whenever we approach an object with certain presuppositions, we are going to miss a lot of stuff. So, and so that perspective, background presuppositions, we can understand this perspective of them from various points. But the basis of it is human finitude of human societies and limitations of space and time, and limitations of human perception and human reasons from all these limitations. So, and one way is to understand this is the phenomenon of attention, because whenever we attend to certain aspect, we are going to miss certain other aspect. A comprehensive, and that's not just correct about our knowledge, but also our actions and our plans and all that. And again, it can be applied to individuals, it can be applied to societies, to ages. So there are limitations of all these three sorts: individual limitation, social limitation, the limitation of age, that is a particular time and space and history. And these all limitations are positive in the sense that through them it is possible for us to grasp the object, but also by the very same logic, they make sure that we miss certain other aspects. So every age has both limitations in terms of its bank of knowledge, and also limitations in terms of its historical limits. And those limits are both limits on what that age can think and know, in a sense, but also limits on the conditions of the possibility of its knowing anything. So there are resources as well. And Islam recognizes this in a sense, when the basic difference between a deen, that's your basic worldview, and different schools of thoughts. What we call al-madahib, al-mazhab, and you have mazhabs, schools of thought, not only in Kalam but in all Islamic disciplines, in fiqh. So, al-mazhab or school can never be equated with ad-din as such, because schools are human efforts, a particular social efforts. So they can never be equated with divine knowledge. On the other hand, deen in itself is based on divine knowledge. And this distinction is based on the idea of human limitations in various ways, which we just discussed. So that's why schools are more like ideologies, particular ways in which a particular problem is understood by an individual or a society based on, in the light of divine injunctions, but based on human sources, human resources, and human limitations, social limitations, and the limitations of a particular age. That's why people, when they talk about a particular school, like an Ashari school, or in Kalam or Maliki school in fiqh, for example, they sometimes seem to think, erroneously I think, that these are schools which were established at a particular time, and they basically contain the insight of their founders. But in fact, if you look at Maliki school, there are many schools within this school, and there is a historical development, progression, and also geographical development and diversification. And the same with Ashari school, etc. And when these schools become stationary, that means that they have outlived their purpose, and people, they need revival or rejuvenation or further development. And this distinction between a deen, which is a divine entity, and school or ideology is the very basis of Islamic tolerance. Because these are not divine, even though they are human efforts based on divine injunction. That's why they are contingent, they are liable to revision and all that. The divine revelation itself cannot be revised, etc. So, in the light of this, let's go back to what I was saying. So the work of later mystics and non-mystic rationalists forms an exceedingly instructive chapter in the history of our culture, inasmuch as it reveals a longing for a coherent system of ideas, a spirit of wholehearted devotion to truth, as well as the limitations of the age, which rendered the various theological movements in Islam less fruitful than they might have been in a different age. So it's possible that, within the limitations of an age, certain. So within the limitations we just discussed, it's possible. So these are structural limitations. So within those limitations, there is possible that we some contingent limitations which made those schools less fruitful than they could have been. But I'm not sure what's the purpose of this, and this question, even contingent limitations are always there. So unless this discussion has any bearing on what we are doing right now, it's a very academic exercise. So let's see. So, but the limitation he's saying is, as we all know, Greek philosophy has been the great culture of thought in the history of Islam. Yet careful. So Greek philosophy, in his mind, seems to have uh, from the background presupposition on which Islamic ilm, rationalist sciences were developed, and that formed a resource, but also a limitation in a way which was contrary to the spirit of Islam and the Quran. So that's his point. But I think we need to look at the actual proposition first. As we all know, Greek philosophy has been a great cultural force in the history of Islam. I think this claim needs to be taken with a lot of skepticism. Firstly, Greek philosophy. Which came through different sources at different period of Islamic history, and influenced different Islamic disciplines and debates. There's no doubt about that. But I think, in my opinion, its influence with the logic, philosophy itself, and then on Kalam, and maybe people will call on Tasawwuf as well, because of the Neoplatonic connections and various other reasons as well. And through logic, it has influenced other Islamic sciences as well, Islamic disciplines. But I think the influence of Greek philosophy is greatly exaggerated in two ways. Even the actual influence on Kalam, which predate Greek philosophy, because the sources of Kalam, if it is a discipline in which you rationally justify the Islamic worldview and defend it against other against possible objections, then it starts with within the Quran, and and then it developed at different stages of Islamic history. Well before it ever had any encounters with Greek philosophy. That's one thing, and the second thing is there has always been, you know, anti or counter Greek schools, um, what can be, generally regarded as empiricist schools, like, early Hanbali and Hanbali schools, um, and also anti-Greek were um, the general Islamic sciences, which were not directly influenced um, by Greek philosophy, and the practitioner of those disciplines always kept their distance and their independence. So even if Greek philosophy influenced certain schools of Kalam, um, there were other currents which weren't influenced, which were actually, even if they were influenced, they were actually actively against the Greek influences. Um, and then bulk of Islamic discipline, which uh, charted a different line with, and always kept independence vis-a-vis so-called Greek influences, and the sciences influenced by Greek philosophy. And the second thing is, in the Islamic culture as a whole, even if we consider Greek philosophy as a great influence on logic and Kalam, for example, at least a specific schools of Kalam, and even if we grant that, um, the role of Kalam in Islamic society is still limited, because the central disciplines of a great interest and influence of Islamic society was not Kalam, but it was mostly fiqh and different disciplines related to fiqh and hadith and different discipline, and the Quran, obviously, and other practical matters. And just because certain people look at debates in Kalam and philosophy, and the names related to those disciplines, and especially related to philosophy, have great prominence, like Avicenna or Averroes or Ghazali, people think that they might have a central place in the Islamic culture, but that's Ghazali for sure has, but not because he wrote something on Kalam and or philosophy, but mainly because of his work in other Islamic disciplines. So I think this whole claim about the influence of Greek philosophy on Islamic culture needs to be investigated further. For too long, we have taken this for granted, these claims, based on very meager research, really, and without thorough conceptual analysis. So I think I'll stop here, probably, and we'll continue from here next time.